Open your Bibles to Genesis 47. The 7 years of famine in Genesis 47 already began. And we're just going to pick it up with verse 20. And Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. For the Egyptians sold every man his field, because the famine prevailed over them. So the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he removed them to cities from one end of the borders of Egypt even to the other end thereof. Only the land of the priests bought he not, for the priests had a portion assigned them of Pharaoh, and did eat their portion what Pharaoh gave them, wherefore they sold not their lands. This is a tradition, by the way, that God would make it a requirement in the Old Testament after the children left Egypt, and Moses gave them the law. Then Joseph said unto the people, Behold, I have bought you this day, and your land for Pharaoh. Lo, here is the seed for you, and ye shall sow the land. And it shall come to pass in the increase, that ye shall give the 5th part unto Pharaoh, and 4 parts shall be your own, for seed of the field, and for your food, and for them of your households, and for food for your little ones. Now some people will preach, and I'll read you someone that wrote about, well, they were only giving a 5th part of their increase. What was beyond what a normal portion would be. That's not how it reads in the Hebrew, by the way. They were going to give a 5th part. Call it a tax, call it whatever you want. But they would give a 5th part back unto Pharaoh. And the amazing thing about it, it's not so amazing if you were living that time and you went through that horrible famine, that the people did not rebel against that, because in verse 25 it reads, And they said, Thou hast saved our lives. Let us find grace in thy sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants. And Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt unto this day, up to the day of the person that authored the book of Genesis, which everyone believes it's Moses. And Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt unto this day, that Pharaoh should have the 5th part, except the land of the priests only, which became not Pharaoh's. Now, that might seem harsh. Well, let me tell you something right now. There's historical records that states that Joseph gave them also an opportunity, or Imhotep in this case, because if you look at the Egyptians' point of view, there was no Joseph, but there was a character called Imhotep. That basically he gave them an opportunity to buy back their lands. And to do so, they would have to buy it back with time, service. And of course, Egyptian historians believe that's how many of the architectural works of the day, of that day, were accomplished. Not so much by slave labor. Now that would come a little bit later, especially when the Hebrews, I believe under the Hyksos kings, became slaves. But prior to that, they were given the opportunity to buy back their lands after this horrible famine. But to do so, they had to do it with some type of commodity. And what they had was food and servitude to the mission that Egypt was trying to accomplish through Joseph's governance. Now, with that, so you know the background of where I'm going and what I'm about ready to read to you, which concerned someone else in history, which I already concluded, and I believe you have too, Imhotep's income tax. Now, Imhotep was none other than Joseph. Pathhotep was none other than Joseph. Imhotep. And Imhotep had different names too, by the way, as Joseph. We're going to get into other names that Joseph or Imhotep possibly carried, depending on which pharaoh existed at the time. And I really haven't got into this that much, but when you see pharaohs in the scriptures or in historical records, even, and there's where the timelines get all askew, because we try to put the pharaohs' chronological order one right after another. But there was many times several pharaohs in Egypt, whether upper or lower or a combination. I believe in Joseph's day, at least 50% of the time that he was living in Egypt, there was a pharaoh, a more dominant pharaoh, and then there was a lesser pharaoh. A more dominant pharaoh gave an opportunity for lesser pharaohs to rule in their own kingdom. Remember, they didn't have the kind of transportation and the availability to be in one place in the morning and 300 miles later at lunch to carry on the business of governing this land of Egypt. Egypt is fairly large, and the major means of transportation was the river, the Nile River. But it still took some time to travel it. So, I believe Joseph, if you study the history, which I didn't get into it because I don't really think it was that pertinent for this particular study, he was not only second command under a main pharaoh, by the way, which would be in Upper Egypt, in Joseph's original starting point, when he addressed a certain pharaoh with the interpretation of a dream. And which pharaoh was that? We could guess the Egyptian name for that pharaoh, but he could have been someone else. And what popular pharaohs that we're more familiar with by name could have Joseph served under? These are all things we're going to take a look at. Now, the more dominant pharaoh, like I said, gave opportunity for lesser pharaohs to establish regions and govern those regions, which Joseph also had control of, or Imhotep. Nevertheless, they were all, let's just call it tax, the income tax of 20%, a fifth of their increase. And people complain about, if they follow the tithing program, 10%, which they don't even live up to because the average is between 2 and 3. There is one last piece of evidence. I don't believe it's the last piece of evidence. There's more to come, which if forever remove the veil of 1,000 years which have heretofore separated Joseph from Imhotep and his third dynasty. It concerns taxation and appears to be solid, conclusive proof that Joseph lived under the reign of King Zoser. And to follow up on what I just said a few minutes ago, I believe King Zoser, a pharaoh, but not the dominant pharaoh of all of Egypt, or the leading head pharaoh, if you want to call it that, of all of Egypt. I believe Zoser was given by a more dominant pharaoh the opportunity to reign and rule over, in this case, Lower Egypt, which would be the northern part, with the dividing line separating north from south around the Giza Plateau, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, that's a bit of information I never shared with you before. And I didn't want to get into all these different dynasty kings or pharaohs, because you talk about taking some time to try to sort all that out where it wouldn't be so confusing any longer. That would take me another 12 messages before I even got up to this point. I don't think it's that important, unless you really want to be a student of Egypt's history and how all these pharaohs lined up and where they were ruling and reigning and what year and what time, what dynasty, which I don't think most of you are that concerned with. You just want to know the basic truth and then move on from there. It concerns taxation. It appears to be solid, conclusive proof that Joseph lived in the reign of King Zoser. This proof comes by the mention of a new type of taxation which was instituted across the great land of Egypt during the reign of King Zoser. Now, this person believes King Zoser was a dominant pharaoh of Egypt. And I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. I think he was a pharaoh, but not the dominant pharaoh. Yes, this tax was invented by none other than Vizier Imhotep himself. And Imhotep, builder in stone, taxes were paid by every noble and peasant. Quote, it was an income tax, end of quote. In Egypt was 1/5 of the harvest and of the increase of cattle, plus several months of labor each year upon great public works by all able-bodied men. And this is what gave them the opportunity to eventually buy back their lands. Now, wait a minute. How could Imhotep be Egypt's most beloved vizier when he is the first to place a tax on people's income? And we already covered that. Because his plan saved people's lives. It saved their children's lives. This should have made him the most despised person in Egypt. I agree. If he just was a politician. Unfortunately, as far as I know, the Egyptians had no record of the 7 years of plenty. Fortunately, the Hebrew record comes to Imhotep's rescue. The book of Genesis talks about this tax. It makes it clear that the taxation was not on the people when they were suffering the 7 years of famine, nor was a tax instituted in normal days when the economy of Egypt was running at its yearly norm. And that's where I disagree. The tax was instituted when the people were prospering more than they ever had. And I agree they were not taxed during the famine years. But they were taxed whether it's normal years or years that showed a abundance increase. And that's where I disagree with this author. Because the Hebrew scriptures don't define it any other way. Yes, the tax came when the people could more than afford it. Not true. During those 7 years of tremendous prosperity. Now we can understand why the Egyptians so desperately loved Imhotep. They desired to render a portion of their wealth because they thought this man of great wisdom had created those 7 years of plenty. I necessarily don't agree with that. Sure, some did. I'm sure of that. And they give him the credit for it. But don't you think for 1 minute that Joseph did not give credit. It made the people know who the credit should be given to. And that was God himself. Surely Joseph could not be loved if he had pulled this taxation stunt in some latter year. But no, the Genesis record not only says that Joseph was loved, but that he had to institute the same type of tax. Yes, the tax was imposed when the crops were more plentiful than they ever had been. But now, if you hadn't yet detected it, here comes the big gun. Look at what your Bible says concerning this tax. And Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt unto this day, that Pharaoh should have the 5th part except the land of the priests, only which became not Pharaoh's, which we already read. Genesis says the amount of tax was 1/5 part. And the tax, according to Egyptian records, of Imhotep was 20%. Well, in case you didn't figure that out yet, 1/5 is 20%. 1/5 of 100% is 20%. Obviously, the taxes were exactly the same. Now, according to Egyptologists, Imhotep of the third dynasty was the inventor and originator of this tax. Yet here in Genesis, it says that Joseph was the first person to institute this tax. And it continues unto this day. Unto this day, obviously, meaning the day that Moses put this down on record. Had Joseph not been the first to implement this tax, the tax would have already been in effect when Joseph invented it. Notice that Joseph did not tax the priests. Generations later, Moses assigned the same principle where the Levitical priests had special exemptions. Was this a carryover from Joseph? Imhotep and Joseph were Egypt's first prime ministers. Both were the first to institute a 20% tax. Obviously, they both were the same person. Another coincidence. This absolute fact is not a hard pill to swallow until one realizes that it demolishes world history as it has currently been constructed. Though proof is a hard scientific term, this evidence gets as close to proof as anything can. Yes, Joseph was Imhotep. Yet, to accept this as fact demonstrates there's 1,000 years discrepancy, and that we must make historical adjustments not to biblical time, but rather to Egyptian antiquity. Another piece of the puzzle. Is it a coincidence? Adding to all the coincidences that we already covered up to this point? And the Bible's lucky. Really lucky to be able to have all these coincidences that match up to history, recorded history. Or is it not coincidence? And recording history is just confirming that the biblical history is the true timeline, the true accurate record, how things went down in those times, in those areas. In other words, it's trustworthy to believe, if you do believe, that it's God's word. Let's look at something else. There's a book out there called World Beyond Our Own. And the writer writes, Ho's research convinces him that Cheops, Khufu, was a contemporary of King Zoser. History recorded the man who assisted Cheops as Souf, S-O-U-F. Foreman of the works of Khufu, or Pathhotep. Write that down. S-A-F-H-O-T-E-P. S-A-F-H-O-T-E-P. Pathhotep. Was one of 12 brothers who built the labyrinth of ancient Egypt for Imhotep III. Interesting, isn't that? Actually, there was 2 researchers that looked into this, and they came close to making a great discovery. But instead of accepting the obvious, they still went traditional timelines and thoughts presented by false theories and placed Joseph in history with Pharaoh Imhotep III, if that's true. Imhotep was Joseph's name under King Zoser, Dynasty 3. And under the fourth dynasty, according to some, his name was changed to Pathhotep, Saf-Hotep, who was a foreigner, not an Egyptian, who also had 11 brothers. Man, another coincidence. And then after Pathhotep died, the office was given to Vizier Heman, and that's a whole other character which does not really apply to this study. Back to this. How Bible scholars and secular historians have both missed these blatant parallels in Egyptian and Hebrew histories is most shameful, and I agree. Yet, it seems that much of their ignorance is deliberate. For some reason unknown, Bible scholars have believed conventional historians, while secularists, in order to prevent its classroom use, have prepared to keep the Bible isolated as a religious document. Together they have produced one certain result. History has run amok with error. So far, we have successfully driven nails in the coffin of traditional Egyptology and spikes through the very heart of secular human history. Now it's time to raise the hammer, strike it yet again. If some raiders are still unconvinced that Joseph was the sage Imhotep/Pathhotep and deduced that our evidence was circumstantial, then it's time we roll in the big guns. And I'm going to get to some of those big guns that's covered in this particular study, and I'm going to introduce even more bigger guns in the weeks ahead. But I think that's as far as I'll go this evening. I'll let that stew for a while. Two other coincidences. You can add it to the list. We did a partial list last week. An income tax, 1/5 part, 20%. That supposedly Imhotep started, but as the author pointed out, if Imhotep started, then Joseph wouldn't have to introduce it, would he? If the biblical record is accurate. No, because Joseph and Imhotep are both the same person, my friend. It was a practice, even practice up to the day of Moses when he wrote down the biblical record of what happened. And God decided to keep that going. And then some, if you calculate all the tithes and offerings of the Old Testament. And not to mention how the priests were exempt from this particular action. And furthermore, we introduced Pathhotep, who served not just under Zoser, not just someone else, which I'll bring up, that you'll find, I believe, very interesting in the coming weeks. Before we get to that, we have to deal with the famine first and some of the structures, I believe, that came out of the famine, used as tools, as governance, an operational facility, and a location which the then known world would travel, because it was just more than Egypt and Israel that were suffering from this famine. It became a central location, a gathering point, administrative building, if you want to call it that. And we're going to look at the Saqqara complex in the coming week or two. And then we will get to other pyramids, including the Great Pyramid. Some interesting things that still lie ahead that will sort this out even more so. How God has kept his hand, and the players that were used at that time to carry out his will. We started with Abraham, we moved on to Joseph. We're going to get to Moses. But there's someone else that needs to be introduced that we can find in Egypt and in the biblical record. If you're interested, let me know. Play the song. Now, let me know if you're interested. I want to continue this, and we have a lot to go. Let me know.